A 13th round of U.S.-China trade talks begin in Washington, D.C. this week against a tumultuous political backdrop. Richard Nephew, senior research scholar at Columbia from New York, to talk us through some of the details from inside out. And I say inside out because Richard has served as Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the U.S. Department of State, and also as the lead sanctions expert for the U.S. team negotiating with Iran. Richard, many thanks for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Richard, in your latest Brookings paper, you say, and I quote, that the events of the last 10 years suggest that Chinese economic sanctions policy is at an inflection point, both in terms of capabilities and readiness. What does this mean, first for US and China, and more so for the countries that are standing by and hoping to profit from this impasse?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that has shifted most is that China is a lot more capable and a lot more willing to use economic tools in order to get its own way in foreign policy. Now, this is something the United States has been doing for a number of years. We've seen this with regard to sanctions policy going back 30, 40 years. But for China, over the course of the last 50, 60 years, they have emphasized mostly economic integration and getting access to the rest of the global economy for development purposes. Now they're starting to see that they can use their access for foreign policy power, and that changes things considerably. It means that the Chinese are going to have not only the ability to influence events around the world, but also the desire to use their economy to their advantage. So for a U.S. president who's looking to make decisions, they're going to have to start anticipating that when they impose sanctions on China, for instance, for doing business with Iran and buying Iranian oil, or doing business with Venezuela, that China might turn around and say, well, fine, then we're going to impose sanctions on your companies for doing business in Taiwan. We're going to impose sanctions on your companies for doing business with people we don't really like or trust in Hong Kong. And you can even imagine other scenarios that could emerge. All of those situations are going to create real policy challenges for a U.S. president who's going to have to decide whether or not it's worth taking on the Chinese in particular areas, and of course for the countries that are going to be affected on the periphery.
You speak of United States vulnerabilities, that China is well positioned to target rising income inequality, over-leveraged corporate sector, and unsustainable public debt. So do you see this adding muscle to China's new approach towards sanctions? Like you say, not as a response, but as an instrument of affirmative policy. How specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Chinese are going to be a lot more able to target those vulnerabilities because they happen to be where China is itself strong. The United States needs access to China for markets. We need access to China for markets of goods that are particularly produced in the United States, including high-end intellectual property and those sorts of things. And we need access to China because they're a large and burgeoning middle class that should be buying things that we wish to sell. And all of that means that we need China. China needs us, but we need China. And if the Chinese decide that they're going to close off their economy to key U.S. companies, that's going to affect political decision-making inside of the United States. It has to, because the United States has got obvious, clear economic interests that are going to be potentially at stake. What it really comes down to is the degree to which China is prepared to absorb cost itself. And this is what we're seeing with the tariff wars thus far. The Chinese didn't start the conflict with the United States at present, but they are fighting it. And I think they're learning a lot of valuable information about where the United States is politically vulnerable and how they can apply pressure on each one of those vulnerabilities.
Richard, just this week, I reviewed a Credit Suisse report. Many investment banks have started putting out reports from their research wings on how many billions of dollars worth of business could move out of China. That's simplistic. What could be the wrinkles on this?
Well, I think the biggest wrinkle, of course, is the Chinese interests themselves, right? We sometimes think about China as wanting to just use its power, in all circumstances. But that, of course, isn't the case. And the Chinese economy right now is faltering in no small part because of how foreign business activity has slowed down, how the ability to invest in China has slowed down, the fact that they've spent a lot of money building apartment blocks that no one's living in as part of the glut in money that they had in the country. So from that standpoint, the Chinese themselves have got some vulnerabilities that probably aren't being anticipated by people who are worried about what China could do. And they don't fully appreciate that China doesn't want to do these things either. So that's wrinkle number one. Wrinkle number two, of course, is that as many banks and investment firms and companies find, if you're not doing business in China, where are you doing business? Now, obviously, India is a place where you could potentially do some business, and the other emerging markets where you could spend a lot more time, energy, and money. But for a number of multilateral banks and companies, they have interests and investments in China for a reason, and I think they want to try and maintain those to the extent possible. So there's definitely a potential for China overstepping how it could use its own tools, and I think the Chinese are sensitive to that. And I certainly think that companies and banks and scholars like myself might be overestimating how much the Chinese could do. But that doesn't undermine the fundamental point, which is that China is in a much more of a position of a powerful country that can use these tools itself rather than just having to take what it gets from everybody else.
Last question, Richard. Chinese officials have not commented, and I don't expect they would. There's a Bloomberg report out that Chinese negotiators are seeking to limit the scope of the trade talks, the 13th round. And this is certainly in the mix. What's the strategy, if it's true?
Well, look, I think that there are two things that the Chinese are thinking about right now. One, they didn't start this fight, and they weren't really excited to have it in the first place. I think they would be satisfied if the trade talks resulted in a let's go back to where things were in January of 2017 end state. If you're China, that's a perfectly acceptable outcome. So I think trying to limit the talks could involve just simply that. Let's not try and solve some fundamental systemic problems, like with regard to intellectual property or broader economic rights and investment rights that countries, including the United States, would want to have in China. I think from that standpoint, it's totally advantageous to the Chinese to try and limit the scope of those talks. I think what's potentially problematic from China's perspective is if you don't take advantage of this opportunity to settle some issues, it just means you're going to have this problem come back up again. And a number of the people who are running for president of the United States have already indicated that they intend to continue with at least some of the Trump administration's approaches with regard to trade and trade disputes with China. So I think they may be advantaged if they try and get a better deal from the Trump administration in the next year than if they hold out for a future administration in the United States. But that doesn't mean from the Chinese perspective it's not worth at least trying to limit the scope and ensure that you're able to resolve the situation immediately, so that way you can at least get the Chinese economy back to where it was before this whole thing started.
Richard Nephew, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.